Bandidos are the second largest outlaw motorcycle club on Earth, and their own motto says it best. We are the people our parents warned us about. Some members lived up to that line more than others. These are 15 of the Deadliest Bandidos members ever. Justin Cole Forster. When federal prosecutors built their racketeering case against the leadership of the American Bandidos, they named 3 men at the very top of the organization. The national president, Jeffrey Pike, the national vice president, John Portillo, and the national sergeant-at-arms, Justin Cole Forster. That third title is the one most people outside the biker world do not understand, and it is the one this entire list is built to explain, because the sergeant-at-arms is the officer in charge of enforcement, discipline, and violence. And to hold that role at the national level meant being the enforcer for the entire club across the country. Forster was in his early 30s when the indictment came down, young to be sitting at that level of a national outlaw organization, which tells you how far and how fast he had risen inside it. The federal case accused the 3 national officers of directing, sanctioning, approving, and permitting members throughout the organization to carry out racketeering acts, murder, attempted murder, assault, intimidation, extortion, and drug trafficking. All of it to protect and enhance the club's power, its territory, its reputation, and its profits. This was not a charge of one bad act. It was a charge that the leadership ran the Bandidos as a criminal enterprise, and Forster held one of the 3 seats at the head of it. His own conduct went past giving orders. Prosecutors tied Forster directly into the club's narcotics machine, and the detail that made it striking was the arrangement the Bandidos had struck with the Texas Mexican Mafia. Under that deal, Bandidos members were allowed to traffic methamphetamine and cocaine without paying the 10% cut, the so-called dime, that the Mexican Mafia normally demanded from anyone moving product on their turf. In other words, the Bandidos were powerful enough that one of the most feared prison and street gangs in Texas treated them as a partner rather than a subordinate. And Forster was named as one of the men running that side of the operation. When the case finally resolved, he pleaded guilty to racketeering, drug trafficking, and extortion, and he faced the possibility of life in federal prison. His story shows what the Bandidos are at the executive level. This is not a club where the violence lives only at the bottom, among reckless members acting on their own. It is a structured organization with a formal chain of command, and near the very top of that chain sits an officer whose defined job is enforcement, an office that exists specifically to make sure the club's will is carried out, and its rules are answered in blood when the leadership decides they must be. Forster held that office for the entire American club, and what that office produces, when it is carried all the way to its conclusion, is the story the rest of these men tell. Philip Knuckles McElwaine. Philip McElwaine had once stood on a podium as a champion. A Commonwealth Games gold medal boxer, he was a man who had represented his country and won at the highest level of the sport, the kind of athlete communities build pride around. Years later, he stood in a courtroom as one of the men charged over the Milperra massacre, the worst outlaw biker shootout Australia had ever seen, and of everyone tried for that day, he was the only one who walked out completely free. The event that put him in that courtroom had been building for a year. The Bandidos in Australia had been born out of a bitter split, when a group of Comancheros broke away from their own club and patched over, and the bad blood between the 2 sides curdled into open threats through 1984. It came to a head on Father's Day, at a swap meet advertised at the Viking Tavern in the Sydney suburb of Milperra, an ordinary Sunday event that families had come out for. When the 2 clubs converged in the car park, they came armed with shotguns, a .357 Magnum rifle, and clubs and bats. And within minutes, the gathering had turned into a close-range battle. When it was over, 7 people were dead. 2 Bandidos, 4 Comancheros, and a 14-year-old bystander named Leanne Walters, killed by a stray bullet. A child who had no connection to either club. 28 more people were wounded. It became the catalyst that forced New South Wales to rewrite its gun laws. McElwaine, known in the club as Knuckles, a nickname a champion boxer earns honestly, was among the bandidos that day, and when the arrests came, Australian law held every participant collectively responsible for the deaths, so he was charged alongside the rest. What followed was one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in Australian history, running well over a year with hundreds of days of evidence, as prosecutors tried to sort out who had done what in the chaos of those few minutes. Dozens were convicted, but the case against McElwaine did not hold, and he was acquitted while the men around him went to prison for years. His acquittal is not the same as having been nowhere near the danger. He was a trained fighter who rode with one of the most violent clubs on earth and stood in the middle of its bloodiest single day. The law could not make its charges stick to him. The reputation of the world he chose to live in stuck all the same. Gregory "Shadow" Campbell. Gregory Campbell rode into the Milperra car park on Father's Day in 1984 as a bandido, one of several brothers from the same family bound up in Australia's outlaw motorcycle world. And he did not ride out. Known as Shadow, he was one of the 2 bandidos killed in the massacre that day, shot dead in the few violent minutes when a swap meet turned into the bloodiest biker battle the country had ever seen. His brother Colin, the club's sergeant-at-arms, was shot 6 times in the same fight and survived. Shadow did not. What makes his death matter beyond the loss itself is what the Australian courts did with it. When the survivors were put on trial, prosecutors used a legal principle called joint enterprise, which holds that everyone who takes part in a violent confrontation can be held responsible for the deaths that result, no matter whose hand or whose side actually caused them. Under that rule, men were charged and convicted over deaths that included their own brothers in arms, because in the eyes of the law, every man who came to that car park armed and ready to fight shared in the responsibility for every body left on the ground. Shadow Campbell's death became part of that reckoning, one of the killings the courts counted when they held an entire room full of bikers collectively to account. His story is not one of what he did to others, but of what his death came to represent. The Milperra massacre was so lethal, so indiscriminate in those few minutes, that the law had to reach for a doctrine that could hold a whole gang responsible at once, and Shadow was one of the men whose deaths proved how far beyond individual control that day had spun. He was a bandido who died in his own club's most infamous fight, and his killing helped write the legal precedent that sent his brothers in arms to prison. Mario "Chopper" Cianter. Mario Cianter was not a foot soldier in the Australian Bandidos. Known as Chopper, he had risen to vice president, a leadership rank in a club that was still new to the country, having been formed only after a breakaway faction of Comancheros patched over and planted the first Bandidos chapter on Australian soil. That made Cianter one of the men at the top of a young and volatile organization, and it put him in the front rank on the day everything the club had been building toward exploded. That day was Father's Day, 1984, in the car park of the Viking Tavern in Milperra, when the Bandidos and the Comancheros collided in a close-range battle of shotguns and rifles that left 7 people dead in a matter of minutes. Cianter was among the dead. He was also family to the Campbells, the brothers who anchored so much of the Australian club's story, connected to them as an adopted brother, which meant that when the shooting stopped, the massacre had killed not just fellow members, but men bound to each other by blood and by choice. 2 bandidos died in that car park, and a vice president of the club was one of them. His death carried a particular weight because of what he was. When a club loses a foot soldier, it loses a body. When it loses a vice president in the middle of a public shootout, it loses a leader, and it advertises to the world that no rank inside that world is safe from the violence the world runs on. Chopper Cianter had climbed to the second highest position in his chapter, and it did not protect him. The same day that made the Bandidos infamous across Australia was the day it killed one of the men who had helped build them. Frederick "Fast Fred" Cortez. In October 2001, a bandido named Javier Negrete was shot and killed outside a San Antonio bar, and inside the club that death could not simply be absorbed. It had to be answered because the entire logic of an outlaw motorcycle club rests on the promise that harming one member brings the weight of all of them down on whoever did it. So the bandidos turned their attention to the man they blamed, Robert Lara, and in January 2002, Lara was murdered in Atascosa County, Texas, in what investigators would later establish was a retaliation killing for Negrit's death. Frederick Cortez, a San Antonio bandito known as Fast Fred, was one of the men federal prosecutors tied to that retaliation. The Lara killing sat unsolved for years, and it was only when investigators built a sweeping federal racketeering case against the Bandidos more than a decade later that it resurfaced as a formal charge. Cortez was arrested and accused of murder in aid of racketeering, a federal count that treats a killing carried out to maintain or advance a criminal enterprise as among the gravest offenses on the books. He pleaded guilty, and he faced life in federal prison for his role in it. What his case lays bare is the machinery underneath the club's brotherhood. The Bandidos present themselves as a family, and the flip side of that family is that a death is expected to be repaid with a death. Javier Negrit was killed outside a bar. The club's code demanded an answer, and Robert Lara did not survive that answer. Cortez was one of the men who carried the weight of it into a federal courtroom and traded the rest of his freedom for his part in a killing the Bandidos treated not as a crime, but as a debt. George Wegers. When George Wegers stood before a federal judge in Seattle to be sentenced, his long gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, he did not apologize for the club he led. He told the court he was proud to be president of the Bandidos, proud of 31 years as a member, and he rejected the government's description of what that club was. Some who knew him said he had tried to change it, to pull the Bandidos away from methamphetamine and violence, and turn it into what one former officer called a working man's club, a brotherhood of men of respect rather than criminals. And even that man, the reformer, the self-described peacemaker, ended up convicted of running a racketeering enterprise. Wegers was the national, and by some accounts international, president of the Bandidos, which placed him at the very top of the entire organization. And in June 2005, the federal government came for him. He was one of 32 people indicted across Washington, Montana, and South Dakota after a 2-year investigation, and the charges against the group were serious: conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering, violent crime in aid of racketeering, drugs, and weapons. As president, prosecutors argued, Wegers held ultimate authority over the club's criminal activity, and the crimes of the members flowed from the structure he sat atop. The case against Wegers personally, though, resolved into something smaller than the headlines. He pleaded guilty to a single count of RICO conspiracy, admitting he had encouraged co-defendants to tamper with a witness and to traffic in stolen motorcycles, and that he had instructed members not to speak to federal agents about a kidnapping. He was sentenced to 20 months, having already served 15, along with a fine and an order to leave the county where the club was based. His lawyers, and even some outside observers, argued the government had stitched a racketeering case together out of relatively minor felonies, stolen bike parts, and a kidnapping that lasted a day. But the conviction stands for something regardless of the size of the sentence, because what the federal case established is that the man at the very top of the Bandidos, even a man reputed to want a cleaner club, presided over an organization the courts defined as a criminal enterprise. Wegers did not personally leave a trail of bodies. What he did was sit in the president's chair and sanction the machine beneath him. And when he was gone, the presidency passed to a man who would take the club somewhere far darker. The peacemaker's real significance is what it proves about the organization itself. If even the president who wanted to reform the Bandidos still ran a racketeering enterprise, then the violence was never the work of a few bad members. It was built into the chair he sat in. John Boxer, Muscedere. In December 2005, the American leadership of the Bandidos sent word north that John Muscedere was finished. The Canadian president and his Toronto crew were not making enough money, were falling behind on their dues, and were running things too sloppily, so the order came down to strip them of their patches and shut the Canadian operation down. Muscedere refused. He had earned the presidency of the Bandidos in Canada only about 5 years after he first entered the biker world, and he was not going to hand the colors back because the men in Texas had decided the northern chapter was no longer worth the trouble. That refusal is what killed him. Known as Boxer, a nickname that came from the thick accent that made people say he sounded like Rocky Balboa. Muscedere led the Toronto chapter that called itself the No Surrender Crew, a name that turned out to be tragically literal. As the pressure from the American leadership mounted, one man was maneuvering in the shadows, a London area bandido named Wayne Kellestine, who had allied himself with a rival faction from Winnipeg and positioned himself to carry out the purge. And here is the cruelty buried inside the story. Muscedere and his crew had once looked after Kellestine. When Kellestine was locked up on an earlier conviction, Muscedere had used his own factory paycheck to help provide for Kellestine's family. And the Toronto Bandidos had paid off Kellestine's overdue mortgage, so he would not lose his farmhouse. That same farmhouse was where Kellestine would lure them to die. On the night of April 7th, 2006, Muscedere and 7 other men were summoned to Kellestine's farm near Iona Station for what was framed as a meeting to settle the club's disputes. It was an execution. The 8 were held at gunpoint through the night and shot one after another, and by dawn, their bodies had been loaded into 4 vehicles and abandoned in a field near the village of Shedden, where a farmer found them the next morning. It became the worst mass killing in Ontario history, and all 8 of the dead were bandidos, murdered by other bandidos. What sets Muscedere apart from the 7 who died beside him is the way he is remembered for facing it. According to the accounts that came out of that night, even the men who killed him acknowledged that boxer Muscedere died like a man, unbroken and unafraid, still refusing to bend to the club that had turned on him. His brother later said John laughed in his final moments because he understood how hollow the whole thing was, and that he died with his dignity intact. He had been a president betrayed by his own organization and led to slaughter at the home of a man he had once saved from ruin, and he met it without surrendering. The crew was called No Surrender, and their president lived up to it all the way to the end. Brett Bo Gardner. Brett Gardner was the youngest of the Winnipeg group in his early 20s, one of the more marginal figures in a crew that was itself only a probationary chapter of the Bandidos, men on the outer edge of the club rather than its core. He had drifted from Calgary into the orbit of the Winnipeg Bandidos, and he was not a decision-maker or a leader. He was near the bottom of the group that gathered at Wayne Kellestine's farm on the night the killing happened. And when the courts were finished, that low standing saved him from nothing. The night of April 7th, 2006, at the farm near Iona Station, 8 Toronto area bandidos were held through the dark hours and shot one by one, and the men who did it were Kellestine and the Winnipeg faction he had allied with. Gardner was among them. In the assembly line horror of that night, prosecutors did not need to prove that Gardner had personally fired every fatal shot, because Canadian law recognizes that everyone who takes part in a planned killing shares the guilt for it, whether they pull a trigger, stand guard, or help handle the aftermath. Gardner had been part of the group that carried the massacre out, and that participation was enough. At the end of the long trial in London, Ontario, the jury convicted him along with the others, and Gardner was found guilty on a combination of first-degree murder and manslaughter counts for his role in the deaths of the 8 men. He went to prison for a slaughter he had been, at most, a junior participant in. That is the detail worth holding on to about Brett Gardner. The Shedden massacre was so complete, so coldly organized, that even the youngest and least important man in the room walked out of it with murder on his record and the rest of his life behind bars. In that farmhouse, there were no bystanders, only killers of different ranks, and the law treated them accordingly. Colin Campbell, the national president of the Australian Bandidos, was in the car park at Milperra that day, but when the shooting was about to start, he reportedly stayed in his car, too afraid to get out. The man who actually led the Bandidos forward was not the president at all. He was the sergeant-at-arms, and his name was Colin Campbell, known to everyone as Caesar, and he was, by most accounts, the toughest and most dominant figure the Australian club had. When the two clubs finally collided on Father's Day in 1984, It was Caesar who walked at the front of his men into the deadliest biker battle the country would ever see. The roots of it went back to a bitter split. Campbell had been sergeant-at-arms of the Comancheros before a faction broke away and patched over to become the first Bandidos chapter in Australia, and the acrimony between the old club and the new one festered for months. By his own account, it was the poison of that split, more than any dispute over turf or drugs, that drove the two sides toward a reckoning. It came at a swap meet at the Viking Tavern in the Sydney suburb of Milperra, an ordinary Sunday market that families had turned out for, on the 2nd of September, 1984. When the Bandidos arrived, they pulled up at one end of the car park, distributed weapons among themselves, and moved down toward the Comancheros, with Caesar Campbell leading them. Within moments, the market erupted into a close-range battle of shotguns, rifles, and clubs. It lasted only minutes, but the toll was catastrophic. 7 people were killed. 4 Comancheros, 2 Bandidos, and a 14-year-old girl named Leanne Walters, a bystander struck in the face by a stray bullet. A child who had come to a Sunday swap meet and never went home. 28 more people were wounded. Among the 2 dead Bandidos was Campbell's own brother, Gregory, and his adopted brother, Mario Cianter, both cut down in the same fight he was leading. Campbell himself was shot 6 times. By the accounts that followed, he took round after round and kept moving, and afterward he spent 6 weeks in intensive care before he checked himself out of the hospital, with shotgun pellets still lodged in his body that his wife later dug out at home before he fled the state. A man shot half a dozen times in a matter of minutes had survived what killed the people standing next to him, including his own blood. That is why Caesar Campbell casts the shadow he does over the Australian Bandidos. The massacre he led became the catalyst that forced New South Wales to rewrite its gun laws, and it triggered one of the longest and most expensive criminal trials in the nation's history. He was the sergeant-at-arms who did what the president could not, walked to the front of the deadliest day in Australian biker history, and led his club into it, lost 2 brothers in the space of a few minutes, absorbed 6 bullets, and lived to walk out of the hospital on his own terms. In a club built on enforcers, he was the enforcer other enforcers measured themselves against. Dwight Big D Mushey. Dwight Mushey was not one of the hangers-on at the edge of the Winnipeg group. He was one of its most dangerous men. Standing well over 6 feet tall, he was a trained martial artist, a second-degree black belt who had worked as both a kickboxer and a boxer. A man built and schooled for violence in a way most bikers were not. Known as Big D, he had come up through Winnipeg's criminal world, his first conviction coming for selling methamphetamine in his home city. And by the time the Bandidos' internal war reached its climax, he was part of the core faction that would carry out the killing. When the Toronto Bandidos were summoned to Wayne Kellestine's farm on the night of April 7, 2006, Mushey was one of the Winnipeg men there to help do what the American leadership had ordered, to strip the Toronto crew of their patches, a purge that turned into the execution of 8 men. Through the long hours of that night, the victims were held and then killed one after another in what the courts would later describe as an almost systematic process. Mushey was not on the fringes of it. He was among the men actively running the slaughter. The jury saw it that way. When the verdicts came down at the trial in London, Ontario, Mushey was convicted of 8 counts of first-degree murder, the most serious verdict available, and the same one handed to the ringleader himself, and he was sentenced to life in prison. That count matters, because not everyone in that farmhouse was found equally guilty. Some were convicted of manslaughter, some of a mix of charges, but Mushey was held fully responsible for all 8 deaths, placed by the court at the very center of the killing rather than its margins. A martial artist who had spent his life training to hurt people had put that training to its darkest possible use, and the law counted him among the men most responsible for the worst mass murder Ontario had ever seen. Michael Taz Sandham. Before Michael Sandham was a Bandido, he had been a police officer. That single fact makes him one of the strangest men in the entire history of the Bandidos. Because the outlaw world is built on a hatred of law enforcement so absolute that cooperating with police is the worst sin a member can commit. And Sandham had once worn the uniform himself. He also had a background in the Canadian military, and he carried that training into the club, styling himself as the leader of the Winnipeg Bandidos faction, and a man who knew weapons and tactics in a way most of his brothers did not. That expertise put him at the center of the killing. On the night of April 7, 2006, when the Toronto Bandidos were lured to Wayne Kellestine's farm to have their patches pulled, Sandham was one of the two men positioned inside the barn with rifles as the victims were brought in. According to the testimony of the informant who survived that night, Sandham was perched up in the loft wearing a bulletproof vest, armed and ready, while below him 8 men were held and then executed one by one. The former police officer had taken a shooting position over a room where a massacre was about to unfold, and he did not climb down and stop it. He helped carry it out. When the trial ended in London, Ontario, the jury convicted Sandham of 8 counts of first-degree murder, the same full-weight verdict given to the ringleader and to Dwight Mushey, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The court placed him among the men most responsible for all 8 deaths. There is a bitter symmetry to where he ended up. A man who had once been sworn to uphold the law had crossed all the way over to the other side, risen to lead a Bandidos faction, and then sat in a barn loft in body armor while his club slaughtered 8 of its own. Whatever had first pulled Michael Sandham out of policing and into the outlaw world, it ended with him convicted of one of the worst mass murders in Canadian history, the ex-cop who became a killer of 8. Richard Stephen Merla. In 2004, a former boxing champion named Robert Quiroga was stabbed to death in San Antonio. Quiroga was not an outlaw or a rival gangster. He was a local hero, the first world champion the city's boxing scene had ever produced, a man people admired. He was killed with a knife, struck 17 times and left for dead, and the man who did it was a bandido named Richard Merla. That killing alone would have marked Merla as one of the most dangerous men the club ever produced. But it was only half of what he did. Merla was already tied to another murder, one that stretched back to the club's blood-for-blood wars. In January 2002, a man named Robert Lara was shot to death in a retaliation killing, payback for the murder of a bandido outside a San Antonio bar. Merla later confessed that he was the shooter, claiming he had fired on the orders of his chapter president, and he described it with chilling simplicity, saying he understood exactly what was wanted of him and that he took care of it. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years for the Quiroga murder, and later another 40 years for Lara. 2 separate killings, 2 separate sentences, stacked one on top of the other. What makes Merla stand out even among killers is how completely he embraced what he was. Years after the murders, speaking to a television reporter, he showed no remorse and offered no apology. Instead, he defined himself by it. He called himself a natural-born outlaw, a true outlaw, and drew a line between himself and the men he considered pretenders, the ones merely playing at the life. To Merla, the killings were not a fall from grace or a mistake he had to live with. They were proof of who he authentically was. That is what places Richard Merla so high. Most of the men on this list killed as part of a war, an order, a purge, a piece of club business, and carried some weight afterward. Merla killed a beloved public figure and a targeted rival, took full blame for the second even as he pointed to the man who ordered it, and then looked into a camera and claimed the identity of a killer as a badge of honor. 2 men died by his hand, 80 years to serve, and a man who insisted to the end that the outlaw who did it was simply his true self. Donald Chambers. In December 1972, 2 drug dealers made the mistake of selling a Bandido baking soda and passing it off as methamphetamine. The man who answered for it was the founder of the club himself. Donald Chambers drove the 2 men out into the desert north of El Paso, had a grave dug, and killed them both, and then their bodies were burned. It was cold, deliberate, and personal, carried out by the man who had built the entire organization, And it tells you that the violence at the heart of the Bandidos was not something that crept in over the years. It was there from the founders' own hands. Chambers had started the club 6 years earlier, in March 1966, walking into a bar in San Leon, Texas, as a 36-year-old dock worker and Marine Corps veteran who had ridden with other clubs and found them all too soft. He built one that answered to no authority at all. He named it the Bandidos after the Mexican bandits who lived outside the law, chose red and gold from the Marine Corps he had served in, and gave it a motto that announced exactly what it intended to be, that these were the people others had been warned about. From that bar, he built the structure the club still runs on, the military-style chain of command, the code of absolute loyalty and total silence, and the rule that violence was the first way to settle a problem, not the last. The desert murders caught up with him. A prospect who had been present confessed to the FBI just 2 days after the killings, and Chambers was convicted of double murder and sentenced to life in prison. He was paroled after about 11 years in 1983, retired from the club he had created, and died of cancer in 1999. His personal reign as an active leader had been short. Only those 6 founding years before prison took him off the board. But that is exactly what makes him so dangerous, because the thing he built did not need him present to keep killing. Every name on this list, the Shedden killers, the Milperra dead, the national presidents who ran empires and ordered murders, all of them operated inside the structure Donald Chambers designed in those first 6 years. He was not the highest body count on this list, and he did not lead the longest. He is here because he was both a man who dug graves in the desert with his own hands and the architect of a machine engineered to generate violence for decades after he was gone. He proved the code with 2 bodies, and then he wrote it into an organization that is still standing more than half a century later. Wayne Kellestine. The farm near Iona Station in southwestern Ontario belonged to Wayne Kellestine, and it should have been the last place the Toronto Bandidos had anything to fear. Kellestine was one of their own, a long-time member, and not so long before, the very men who would die on his property had looked after him, paying his overdue mortgage so he would not lose that farm, providing for his family while he was behind bars. On the night of April 7th, 2006, he turned all of it into a trap. He summoned 8 men to his farm for what was supposed to be a meeting to settle the club's disputes, and by the next morning, all 8 were dead. Kellestine was the ringleader. He had grown estranged from his own Toronto chapter and had allied himself with a breakaway faction from Winnipeg, and he had taken orders from the American leadership of the Bandidos to pull the patches of the Toronto crew, to shut them down. He turned that order into a slaughter. Through the long hours of that night, the 8 men were held at his farm and then killed one after another in a process the courts would later describe as almost methodical, an assembly line of death. When it was finished, the bodies were loaded into 4 vehicles and driven off to be abandoned in a field, where a farmer discovered them the next day. It became the worst mass killing in the history of Ontario. The betrayal underneath it is what makes Kellestine's crime so dark. Among the dead was John Muscedere, the Canadian president, a man who had once used his own paycheck to help provide for Kellestine's family. Kellestine had accepted that kindness and then engineered the man's murder in his own barn. This was not a rival club or an outside enemy. It was a bandido luring his own brothers to his home and killing them there over club politics and pressure from bosses in another country. Jeffrey Fay Pike. To the outside world, Jeffrey Pike looked like a retiree who restored classic cars. He lived north of Houston, presented himself as a clean-cut American who simply loved riding his motorcycle, and told a magazine editor he was usually in bed by 10. He was also, for more than a decade, the national president of the Bandidos, sitting at the very top of one of the largest and most dangerous outlaw motorcycle organizations on Earth. And the calm businessman image was the mask over a man who directed murder without ever needing to be in the room when it happened. Pike took over the presidency in 2005 after his predecessor pleaded guilty to a federal racketeering charge, and under him, the club's violence sharpened into something directed from the top. He did not carry out killings himself. He ordered them. The clearest example came in 2006, when a man named Anthony Benish tried to start a Hells Angels chapter in Texas, Bandidos territory, and ignored repeated warnings to stop. Pike and his vice president ordered him killed, and Benish was shot dead with a single rifle round outside an Austin restaurant as he stood with his girlfriend and her children nearby. That was how Pike operated. A word from the president's chair, and a man on the other side of the state died for flying the wrong flag. The event that made his presidency infamous was one he was not even present for. On May 17, 2015, a gathering of bandidos at a Twin Peaks restaurant in Waco collided with their rivals the Cossacks, and the parking lot erupted into gunfire. When it ended, 9 people were dead, dozens were wounded, and around 177 were arrested. The deadliest biker shootout in American history. Pike was nowhere near it, but prosecutors argued the bloodbath grew directly out of the culture of violence he had built at the head of the organization, a war footing he and his leadership had put the club on. The mask came off in 2018. After a 3-month federal trial, a jury convicted Pike of racketeering conspiracy, murder in aid of racketeering, and a string of related counts, finding that he and his vice president had run the Bandidos as a criminal enterprise that used murder, assault, extortion, and drug trafficking to hold its power and territory. He was sentenced to life in federal prison, plus 10 years. The clean-cut man who loved his motorcycle will die behind bars. What puts Pike at the very top is what his conviction proved. This was not a wild foot soldier or a single reckless chapter. This was the national president, the man in the highest chair the American Bandidos have, found by a federal jury to have directed murder as a matter of club business. Everyone else answered to someone. Pike answered to no one, and from that chair he sent orders that ended lives across an entire state, presided over the era that produced the worst biker massacre the country had ever seen, and ran the machine that Donald Chambers had built all the way to its most lethal conclusion. Of every deadly man the Bandidos ever produced, the deadliest was the one at the top, giving the orders, right up until the day the law finally reached the president's chair. 15 men, 3 countries, and a body count from desert graves to a Waco parking lot. Some ran the machine, others turned it on their own brothers. But the Bandidos never rose or fell alone, because standing across from them the whole time was the one rival as ruthless as they were, the Hells Angels. And the Angels had produced a killer more feared than anyone on this list. A man who ordered the murder of prison guards to terrify an entire justice system. He was untouchable until one of his own assassins sat down with the police and talked. Click the next video for the man who brought down the most dangerous Hells Angel who ever lived.